I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 197th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to better help the workings of your own brain, which, not surprisingly, a lot of times involves giving some thought to how your brain is actually doing its own jobs. Right now is back to school time. This is the first episode of the fall of 2017, and it seemed like as good a time as any to have an episode about thinking, also known as metacognition, which is a subject that's getting a lot of attention nowadays. Everything from metacognition in babies to metacognition in animals to metacognition in AI systems. We're going to be talking with one of the leading researchers into metacognition, Dr. Stephen Fleming, in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, keeping it on the metacognitive theme, I'm going to tell you a little more about what science has found about metacognition in some of our closer animal relatives, the great apes. That'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, but right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so I actually found a This Week in Neuroscience topic that is very much about metacognition. In this case, thinking about other people's thinking. So not self-directed metacognition, but metacognition put to really good use. This was a paper based on recent research out of MIT's Sloan Neuroeconomics Lab at Princeton University, published in the journal Nature late last year. And it describes a new algorithm called the surprisingly popular algorithm, which is a method for getting more accurate answers to questions for which the answer is not known, getting those answers from crowds. You've got a large group of people and essentially a multiple choice question where you're not sure what the right answer is. You ask everybody in the group the question, what they think the answer is, and then what they think the majority of people will think the answer is. So what do you think, and what do you think everybody else in the aggregate is going to think? Sometimes these two answers might be the same from one person, sometimes it might not be. To think of a neuroscience example, a question might be, what percent of the human brain actually gets used? And you might have options 10%, 50%, 100%. A lot of people have heard that myth, you only use 10% of your brain. You know the truth, the answer is 100%. But you think, well, a lot of people have heard that 10% thing and that gets repeated a lot, so maybe other people are going to say it's 10%. The researchers take all these answers, they aggregate them, and then they look at the difference in the prevalence between groups that think the answer is one thing, and then looked within those groups how they expected the majority to come down on the question. And what they looked for was the largest discrepancy there, a group that said, I think the answer is this, but I really think that everybody else is going to think the answer is this other thing. And it turns out that more often than not, where there's a large discrepancy between the believed answer and what they believe will probably be the popular answer, that minority view is often right. These are people that expect that they've got some sort of insider knowledge that isn't shared by everybody. They expect the majority is going to be wrong. The example that the authors use in the paper is a yes or no question. Is Philadelphia the capital of Pennsylvania? A lot of people think the answer is yes. Philadelphia is a big, famous city. It's not the correct answer. The actual capital is Harrisburg, so the answer should be no. But you can kind of game this out in your head. If you know that Harrisburg is the capital of Pennsylvania, you probably still recognize that a lot of people have probably never heard of Harrisburg and they think that Philadelphia is the capital. So odds are good that a lot of people that do know the correct answer still expect that the majority is going to get the wrong answer. Whereas if you're one of the people that thinks that Philadelphia is the capital, you probably assume that everybody else is going to know too. There's no reason to suspect that you have a minority opinion, so you would see a close convergence there between what those people think and what they expect everybody else is going to think. This algorithm obviously isn't a foolproof solution. It's still just based on aggregate survey data of humans who might be wrong, but they did find in real-world tests compared to simple majority votes, the surprisingly popular algorithm outperformed by 21.3%, and actually even slightly better, it outperformed by 24.2% a basic confidence-weighted vote where you gave an answer and you also gave a weighting to your own confidence in your own answer. So working in this metacognitive aspect of what you think other people are likely to think seems to be quite a boost, explains one of the study's authors, John McCoy, a doctoral student at MIT. A lot of crowd wisdom weights people equally, but some people have more specialized knowledge, and this algorithm attempts to identify them. His co-author, Drazen Prelik, says, the argument made in this paper, in a very rough sense, is that people who expect their opinion to be in the minority deserve some extra attention.
Smart Drug Smarts. The podcast so smart, we have smart in our title. Twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Florian Unni from Germany says, "Since its inception, I have unknowingly suffered from a Smart Drug Smarts deficiency. Now, about 30 episodes in, I am 100% anti-bored." I think that is a fantastic adjective, anti-bored. I'm going to start working that into conversation. Florian also says, "Since I hope this review will be featured in an upcoming episode, greetings also to my mom, Iris." Well, thank you, Florian, and hello, Iris. And listener Tackmaster from the USA says, "Fortunately, at my job, I can listen while I'm working, so I get a lot of time to learn from Jesse and his guests. Unfortunately, I'm almost caught up on the old episodes, and am not looking forward to a weekly wait for new episodes." Sorry about that, Tackmaster. But a big thanks to both of you. Thanks to everybody that's been leaving iTunes reviews or spreading the word in any number of other ways. Thanks also to a listener who pointed out in an email how ridiculous everything sounds if you listen to this podcast on half speed. I tried this myself, and I never realized how much the caricature version of drunk people really just sounds almost exactly like regular speech slowed down. Want to give a shout out to both of our sponsors, Vitamonk.com and AxonLabs.io, supplement companies with high-quality products and hard-to-pronounce ingredients. We try to keep the names relatively manageable, things like mitogen and glycotrax, but when you've got ingredients like pterostilbene with a silent P and phosphatidylserine and idebenone, that can get a bit tricky. But most importantly, each of those sites offers links back to the original studies into the compounds that went into those formulations. You can see what they're doing for you, why they might be a good fit, why they might not be a good fit. But if you're looking for supplements for just about anything, check out Vitamonk. If you're particularly in the market for mitogen or Nexus, which we've talked about on past episodes, then the place to go is AxonLabs.io. Smart Drug Smarts does have a newsletter. We call that the Brain Breakfast. Partway through a 2-parter post right now. I'll give the second half of that next week. But lots of wild ruminations, half-baked theories, and oftentimes a little bit of science to go behind them. If your email inbox is not crowded enough already, you can get signed up at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So it's funny, I was reading about Aristotle in the research for this week's Brain Breakfast, and although this part wasn't directly relevant, one of Aristotle's famous things he said, among the many, is that courage is the first among human virtues because it's the one virtue that makes all other virtues possible. If you're not ready, willing, and able to stand up for yourself, then other things you may have going for you don't ultimately matter. That kind of got me thinking, echoing that idea, metacognition is the type of cognition that makes all other types of cognition visible. It doesn't really matter how good your memory is, how good you are at learning, how quick your reaction times are. All these things would be completely invisible to us, and it wouldn't feel like anything to be a person if we couldn't reflect at some level on our own thinking. So on the one hand, metacognition seems to be inextricably tied together with what we think of as consciousness, sort of the awareness that we are beings with identities and things going on, and that there is a world we're participating in. And also, as we'll discuss in this interview, there's some very nuts and bolts reasons why metacognition is absolutely crucial, and none of these other faculties would really matter if we didn't have the ability to think about our thinking as sort of an overseer to check, hey, did this last thought that I had actually work right? Is my thinking producing the desired outcomes? It's like a little kid learning their math tables. If you never go back and check your work, if you don't know how to check your work, you're probably going to have a lot of mistakes. These are the kind of issues that are being researched by Dr. Stephen Fleming. He is the principal research associate at the Wellcome Trust Center for Neuroimaging at the University College London. His work there focuses on the mechanisms supporting conscious awareness, metacognition, and decision-making in the adult human brain. He is the winner of numerous awards like the William James Prize from the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. The Association of Psychological Science declared him a rising star in 2015. And just last year, the British Academy gave him the Wiley Prize in Psychology. So if we're talking about metacognition, we could not come to a better place. Inevitably, you knew I would have to say this because this is an episode about metacognition. This is our metacognition episode. So let's jump in with Dr. Stephen Fleming.
So metacognition literally means cognition about cognition, and the definition comes from the Greek meta, just means along with or above and beyond. And it's got this flavor of self-reflection. So this ability of the human mind to know that it knows something. And as psychologists, we also interchangeably use the term self-knowledge or introspection. But the basic idea is that metacognition refers to the brain's ability to reflect on and monitor other cognitive processes. So to take a simple example, you might be watching a film and an actress comes on the screen and you say to yourself, I know that person from another film, but you can't quite remember it. And you keep on searching your memory and you're literally putting in effort searching your memory until you suddenly realize which film or TV TV program she was in recently. And so that's metacognition right in action. So it's quite strange when you pause and think about it for a while. So somehow that phenomenon shows us that your brain, or you know something about your memory, even though you can't actually know it at the moment when you're realizing that you know it.
It reminds me of the old days of libraries back when they had card catalogs before Google. It's like you can find the memory card of this piece of information is in here somewhere, but the actual book isn't on the shelf when you go looking for it.
Right, exactly. It's got this flavor of what computer scientists refer to as content addressable memory, right? So there's this idea that there's another part of the system that knows what the system knows. And as your example really nicely highlights, sometimes that goes wrong. So sometimes metacognition gets it wrong. Sometimes we think we know something when we don't, or we're confident in a particular answer when we've actually got it wrong. So part of the game of studying metacognition in the lab is to try and tease apart changes in people's metacognitive abilities and understand all the various factors that come together to produce good metacognition.
I imagine that probably the variance of one person to the next in their metacognitive abilities is as wide as their variance in anything else, that some people are metacognitive superstars and other people can't tie their shoes metacognitively speaking. What do we know about that, the degree of variance from one person to the next?
Yeah, so there's individual differences in metacognition, just like there are individual differences in other aspects of mental function. So a central finding in metacognition research over the past couple of decades is that metacognition is partly independent of the cognitive process that it monitors. And as I mentioned before, it can fall foul of various illusions or distortions. A general rule of thumb from this research is that when a task feels easy, then we're more likely to be confident, even if we're not actually doing very well. And so people differ in their ability in which they can discount these various influences on their metacognitive judgments to really tap into the underlying performance. So people differ in how well they can monitor their objective performance. And this is something we've done quite a lot of work on in my lab, where we've been quantifying in tightly controlled experiments, such as asking people to tell what they can see on a computer screen. On each judgment in that experiment, we ask people for their confidence in getting the right or wrong answer. And we can then build up a picture of how closely that confidence reflects their objective accuracy. And what we found is that metacognitive ability, how tight your performance is tracked by your confidence, does indeed vary between people. It varies independent of their objective performance on the task. So you can be doing the task quite well, but have poor metacognition, and vice versa. And so we've discovered that there's particular regions of the brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, where there are differences in the structure and function of the brain areas in the prefrontal cortex that predict how well someone will be at this metacognitive ability.
So I'm picturing like somebody who says, oh, I'm not very good at this, but clearly they are. And looking at that as an outside observer, your first inclination is to think, well, this person's just being modest. Intuitively, we think, well, this is something emotional or psychological about the person, not that they might actually be wrong about it in an objective sense. That must have been difficult to sort of disentangle in your studies.
Right. So it's important to get straight exactly what we're trying to measure here. So you're absolutely right that someone's overall level of confidence, or whether they have high or low self-esteem, whether they just generally feel confident in doing these kind of tasks, is going to feed into these judgments. And so that's also something we're interested in the lab in a separate line of work, where we're trying to think about what produces high or low self-confidence, self-belief. But in these studies of metacognition, we're trying to actually kind of push that to one side. So what we're actually interested in is not your overall level of confidence. We're actually interested in how your confidence fluctuates from moment to moment, and whether those fluctuations track your underlying performance. So you might actually be quite a low confidence person, but your fluctuations in confidence might track your underlying performance. And that's what we're trying to measure in these kind of studies.
What would be an example of something where people have a high level of confidence? They think something is easy, but they are not performing very well.
So there was a really neat set of studies done by the social psychologist David Dunning, Kruger, who asked people to carry out various kind of real world tasks, such as getting up and giving a talk, or they even had one condition which was doing stand-up comedy. And what they found was that people who were actually performing quite badly at those tasks were also the ones who were more overconfident. And they called this the unskilled and unaware of it phenomenon. And, it's a super interesting result. I think what we're trying to do in our studies of metacognition is trying to kind of pull apart the different reasons that might go into that overconfidence. On the one hand, you have these differences in overall self-belief, which I mentioned before. And then on the other hand, you have this kind of more what we call in the lab monitoring. So how can you tell from a moment-to-moment basis whether you're performing well or badly? And I don't think we know yet whether that Dunning-Kruger effect is mainly driven by poor skilled people just being generally overconfident in that particular task, or whether it's driven by a failure of monitoring.
And I imagine that this is probably one of these cases where people that have gotten brain injuries in various ways could be really informative in seeing like, okay, this piece of the brain is clearly critical in this type of self-monitoring. But for non-pathological cases or cases where there's not clearly like an outside influence on the brain, somebody got a firm whack in the head, what do we know about the learning process involved or developmental things that make some people maybe more accurate in their metacognition than others?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's one that's actively being researched at the moment. I mean, one thing we can say is that even if you don't have a brain injury, for instance, one of the, I think, key discoveries of cognitive neuroscience over the past few years has been that there are still subtle differences in structure that we can pick up on, for instance, an MRI scan that are systematically related to subtle differences in behavior and personality. And that's definitely the case for metacognition. That's something we've replicated now in a few studies, that people who have better metacognitive abilities have differences in the structure of their prefrontal cortex and the connections to the prefrontal cortex. So what we're trying to do now is use mathematical models to say, well, if I was to design, say, a robot to have metacognition, which is a whole other set of issues there, but if I was to try and design a kind of really small toy bit of computer code that could do metacognition, what would I need to put in there to get it to solve our tasks? And it turns out there are a few pieces that you need to put in there. So intuitively, to monitor your performance, you need to not only know what was the right answer, but you also need to know what you did. So it's kind of got this higher order flavor to it. You need to both monitor the input and the output. And we think that there are areas of the prefrontal cortex that are doing those computations. And the next phase of studies will really be to kind of try and link that back to those individual differences. So do people who have better metacognitions, are they somehow implementing these computations better? So that's an open area of study at the moment. And in terms of development, this is really interesting because up until a couple of years ago, people thought that metacognition was this aspect of development that really came in at quite a late stage, that it required this explicit, even linguistic ability to say something about your mind. But now there's been recent studies, this is carried out in my colleague Sid Kuiday's lab in Paris. He's been doing very interesting experiments on 6 and 12-month-old infants using these implicit measures of how confident are they in searching for a particular toy, for instance, in a play scenario. And he finds that he can actually quantify their metacognitive ability and show that they do have some sense that they're confident in making a right or wrong decision. And so another really interesting line to take there would be to say, okay, are these just initial germ seeds of metacognition that we see in the infants? Do they somehow predict whether you're going to have good metacognitive ability later in life?
It almost seems like there's this top-level metacognition of like, do I know this thing or not, versus kind of the deeper level of trying to assess how your thinking process actually works. There are some things that we sort of have intuitions about how our thought process goes, where I guess we kind of think more about the actual thought process rather than just, does this piece of information exist, yes or no, and getting sort of a binary answer out of it.
I think that's right. I think, often when we're studying metacognition in the lab, we're studying this monitoring process, which is relatively easy to study because you can just ask people occasional judgments of how confident they are in their answers. But then you have this other aspect of metacognition, which is knowing about the kind of thinking processes that are going on. We know very little about that. One thing we do is that it seems to be your metacognition for your thought process itself seems to be even poorer than your metacognitive monitoring of your knowledge, is saying something.
If you thought you were bad before, try this.
Exactly. So an example of that is if you put people in a setting where you get them to make a decision about, say, which face they find more attractive in a pair of pictures, and then you actually perform a trick where you say to them, okay, here's the face you chose, and you give them the wrong one, but you actually ask them to justify why they chose it. Some people, some of the time, won't notice the switch, and they will also go on to justify why they chose it. And this is known as choice blindness, that you have this kind of blindness to what drove your choice in the first place. And so that's an aspect of metacognition that we don't understand very well in terms of how it works in the brain. But it does seem as though we're just not very good at introspecting on what drove our decisions.
I guess you want to sort of point the finger at cognitive dissonance there and just say, like, the earlier version of you from 5 minutes ago is still the home team. You're rooting for that person to be right. So whatever they said, you'll find a way of justifying it.
Right, absolutely. I think there is certainly an element of self-justification to those retrospective defenses of what decision we made.
How have your studies looked at things like meditation and other processes where a person is explicitly taking the time to look inward and contemplate, rightly or wrongly, what's going on within their mind?
So we haven't directly looked at that in our lab, but there have been a couple of interesting papers on meditation suggesting that if you're trained to meditate over a period of 2 weeks and you haven't done it before, then when we give you the same task again, then your monitoring is improved somewhat. So I think there is something to that this continued engagement, being more self-focused and self-reflective, probably will have plastic effects on the kind of brain circuitry that's involved in metacognition. Another way that we've been looking at this is by setting up a training protocol where we can get people to perform tasks. We're actually doing this over the web, so people aren't coming into the lab. We give them a task to do over the internet, and then they can do it whenever they like. But every day they get a little email saying, okay, it's time to log in for your 15 minutes of metacognitive training now. And what we found is that after a 2-week training period, people's ability to monitor their decisions, to know when they're right or wrong, is systematically improved. But what's really interesting is that then transfers to a new task that we give them after training. So we then give them a memory quiz, and we find that people have better metacognition about that memory quiz, even though they've never been trained on it. So that does suggest to us that there's something core about, there seems to be a kind of common mechanism that might be involved in reflecting on your decisions in lots of different tasks. And that's quite exciting for us, because that means that we might be able to devise a setup to improve metacognition in cases where it goes wrong, and do so in a way that then is going to help you in the real world.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because skill transfer across domains is a famously difficult thing to actually pull off.
Absolutely.
Because metacognition can touch on almost anything, this might be one of the rare instances where learning one specific thing really well could have global benefits.
I think that's right. I think the fact that metacognition has this domain general flavor to it suggests that, if you can improve it in one domain, then it might be one of those abilities. And obviously, as you say, transfer is a controversial subject, but it does seem to be one of those abilities that might have more chance than others of transferring.
So let's say in your studies, you find the top 5% of people in their metacognitive abilities, they accurately track their performance with their assessment of their own performance. What do we see as far as how that sort of scales up to how those people live and behave and have results in the real world? Are these people top income earners? Are they happiest in their marriage? I mean, what do we know about them demographically?
Yeah, that's really interesting. We don't know very much, actually. So there's a lot of work done on, for instance, the relationship between your performance on intelligence tests, success in various aspects of life, like earnings and whether you're going to get a good degree and so on. We know much less about what metacognition gives you in everyday life. But I think it's becoming increasingly realized that in lots of areas of life, just raw intelligence is not enough. So we know that metacognition in studies in educational settings, we know that metacognition is critical for learning. So for instance, a student who reflects that they've not learned enough for an upcoming exam, they're making a metacognitive judgment about the strength of their memory in maths or physics or whatever it is. And if that judgment is accurate, then that will prompt them to go and study more. The problem comes when someone has poor metacognition and they think, okay, I've studied, I'm all good. But then they just flunk the test because they actually should have studied for longer. So I think finely tuned metacognition, it's clear from the studies in the lab and also in educational settings, finely tuned metacognition helps us realize the limits of our knowledge and should therefore link to all these benefits in everyday life. But those studies just haven't been done.
Has there been much looking into the social aspects of metacognition versus right or wrong answer, sort of more binary type things?
Yeah, there's not much yet. So this is something we're becoming increasingly interested in our lab, is how people maybe use their metacognitive abilities to not only reflect on their own thoughts, but also to infer what other people are thinking. So this is known as, this is an area of study called social cognition. And, there's quite a lot known about the brain regions involved when we're trying to infer how much someone else is thinking. What we don't yet know is how closely related that is to metacognition about ourselves. It seems like it should involve similar processes, but that's not so well known yet. What we do know is that having the ability to share confidence or to share our assessments of our own thinking process is very helpful to combine opinions in a group, for instance. And there's colleagues of mine at UCL who have done very interesting experiments on this, precisely quantifying how sharing our metacognitive judgments can then help people make better group decisions.
One of the things that I find myself wondering about this is sort of the theory of mind. And one of the questions that always comes up, do we have the ability to think about what others might be thinking because we have this ability to introspect that came first? Or did the evolutionary usefulness of being able to predict what other beings in our social world are thinking, then we sort of turn that same gaze inward, and that gave us metacognitive abilities as sort of a nice bonus?
I mean, this is certainly something we're pursuing at the moment. We're analysing experiments on exactly this issue. One thing we can say is that the brain regions that are involved in metacognition about yourself seem quite different to the brain network that is engaged when you're thinking about other people. So just on that basic result, that does suggest there are going to be different processes involved. So there have been quite a lot of speculation in the literature about how wouldn't it all be neat and nice if it makes a very compelling story if the way that we gained self-awareness back in the days when we were sitting around in caves was we suddenly applied theory of mind to ourselves and we were like, aha, I can think as well. But I don't think it's going to be like that. I think the neuroscience on this issue is going to probably turn out to be that we have quite different systems for self-monitoring and inferring the mental states of others.
You mentioned the studies that they've done in 6 and 12-month-year-old human infants. Have there been any animal studies that have had bearing on metacognition?
There have, and I think they have also benefited from these techniques where we can now measure metacognition without requiring people to actually make a verbal report about what they're thinking. So you can set it up such that instead of making a confidence judgment or a rating about your decisions or your memories, you can set it up such that the animal can bet on whether they've made a good or bad decision. So they can make a second choice, which they get trained is rewarded according to the accuracy of their first choice. So this is kind of like a metacognitive wager on whether they think the first decision was right or wrong. And so this has been used to great effect in studies of apes and monkeys, and even rats can do this effectively. And so it suggests that there's this kind of core computation or core circuitry involved in monitoring and computing confidence in whether things have gone right or wrong that is shared in several animal species. What we don't yet know is to what extent human metacognition is similar to animal metacognition. So we know that some of the core components are shared, but we don't know whether the whole set of components are shared.
To what extent do you think our ability with language does or doesn't help us metacognitively speaking? In some sense, like that tip of the tongue phenomenon, you just kind of have a feeling. It's not something that you're linguistically thinking your way through. You just kind of have the feeling like I know this thing or I don't. Whereas other introspections feel self-narratized in a way.
Yes, I think you touched upon something that is actually quite related to the animal studies, because what most people agree on in this area is that animals have that feeling that something has gone right or wrong. Whether it's conscious or not, that's a whole different issue, but they seem to have this kind of lower level feeling that feeds into metacognition. And that's sometimes referred to as implicit metacognition. So it's just kind of this lower level of monitoring. And then we also have this ability to create an explicit narrative about what's going on in our own minds. And that's probably something we don't share with animals. So there's been this recent proposal in the literature that we can start to divide up metacognition into both its lower level and higher level aspects. And that this explicit narrative we create, that's not very well understood, but we think that it might be related to the brain regions that I talked about earlier. So these regions right towards the front of the prefrontal cortex that are particularly enlarged in humans actually compared to non-human primates like monkeys. And we don't really know why they're so enlarged relative to monkeys. So one hypothesis is that these regions, the contribution they make to metacognition is really facilitate this explicit report, this explicit narrative about our behavior.
What proportion of the work done in the brain would sort of be classified overall as metacognition? Checks and balances on what we know and how we're performing. To go back to the library analogy of the books in the library versus the card catalog, what percentage of the brain is the card catalog versus the books?
That's a really tough question. No one's ever asked me that. I mean, we can start to approach that question by thinking about systems in the brain that are involved in primary sensation like vision and touch and hearing, they all have dedicated areas of the brain for processing those inputs. So you can kind of think of those areas as being what we call first order. So you can start to divide up processes into whether they're first order or whether they're second order. So they involve this metacognitive aspect. And so there's clearly lots of sensory areas in the brain that are more first order. Then you can also think of kind of memory storage as being more first order. The problem is when you start thinking about higher functions like decision making, it gets really hard, because certainly in the lab, we talk about first order decisions. You know, you make an initial decision to a stimulus, or you make an initial decision about whether you can retrieve something from memory. But then probably at the very same time, you're also engaging these second order processes. So it's very hard to then say in the brain whether something is first order and second order. And because another thing that makes doing neuroscience really messy, but also really interesting, is the fact that everything's connected to everything else, and that you also have a lot of top-down connections. So even those sensory areas that I mentioned are also getting a lot of top-down inputs from regions that we would typically think of as being involved in higher cognition. So I think it's quite hard to say that is definitely not metacognitive or that is definitely metacognitive. But there's a kind of a gradient in the brain, if you like, of more metacognitive or less metacognitive processes.
Is there any parallel to be made between metacognition and proprioception, the mental sense of where your physical body is in space? It almost seems like proprioception could be thought of as metacognition for the motor cortex.
It's interesting. I think most people would think of proprioception as being this first order sense that you kind of have these inputs which tell you about where your body are. But there is certainly a recent suggestion that our ability to sense what's happening in our body may feed into metacognition in ways that we're not really aware of. So there's been experiments done to show that changes in, for instance, our heart rate or our pupil size, these things that are controlled relatively unconsciously, they are related to our metacognitive judgment. So it seems like there are all these things happening in our body that are being monitored, and that monitoring seems to bleed into our metacognitive judgments in ways that we don't really understand yet.
Do we know anything about how a person's aptitude at metacognition changes over the course of their lifetime? Have there been any studies following people, tracking them with age?
They have. And what we know is that the metacognition seems relatively well preserved, actually, in older age. So what you might imagine based on the neuroscience of metacognition is that because metacognition involves these prefrontal regions that we know decline in function with age, you might imagine metacognition also declines. And there are hints of this. We actually published a paper suggesting that metacognition does slightly decline with age. But we've also done more recent studies with many, many more people. And we think that if that decline is there, it's much less than you might imagine based on a complete drop-off in prefrontal function, for instance. So what we think might be happening there is that people have developed solid strategies for monitoring what's happening, and you don't really need to learn those strategies anymore when you're older. And so you're tapping into the right cues that predict whether you're going to be right or wrong. And so you don't need to have this efficient online monitoring anymore. And so that's one hypothesis about what's happening in aging. But it does seem that in healthy aging, at least, metacognition is relatively unimpaired.
It seems like the brain would also want to preserve as long as it possibly could its metacognitive abilities. If you had to sacrifice something, that would not be what you want to sacrifice.
Right, exactly. I mean, if your cognitive abilities are declining, it'd be quite useful to at least know that that's the case, right? So you can then take steps to adapt. You can see that being the case in cases of dementia, for instance, where metacognition does take a really big hit. And this can lead to serious problems with monitoring behavior, because if you're not aware that your memory is failing, for instance, then you're not going to take steps to adapt to these changes or so on. And this is what psychiatrists often refer to as lack of insight. And we think that this is partly due to the disease attacking brain regions involved in metacognition. And I think that kind of work is quite important, because at the moment that lack of awareness is often ascribed to denial or someone just being difficult, and it can be quite frustrating and heartbreaking for families. But if we can start understand what metacognition is and communicate that research to families and say, no, well, actually maybe these diseases are attacking brain regions involved in metacognition, then they might understand more why people with these diseases are suffering from lack of awareness.
Tell me about the current studies that you have going on and also what you see as sort of the takeaway findings, what we've learned about metacognition that people could apply in their own lives.
The open areas of investigation in the lab at the moment are really focusing on trying to understand more about whether metacognition is really this one central resource that we apply to lots of different tasks. So I mentioned earlier that it does seem that training metacognition in one domain allows us to have better metacognition in another, but we don't know the limits to that. And we don't know, for instance, in the brain, whether the brain regions and circuits that support metacognition in one domain, are they the same or different as the brain regions supporting metacognition in another domain? So we're doing quite a lot of studies on that issue. And then we're also doing more studies looking at the computations that support our ability to generate confidence in our decisions. One exciting line of work there is to really treat metacognition as another decision that the brain's making, but it's now not a decision about the outside world, it's a decision about its own processes. So you can think about it as like a decision about a decision. So we're trying to build models of how that might work and why that might go wrong. And then in terms of lessons to take away, I guess one is to recognize that metacognition is important in guiding our learning or study in any particular area. And often that's underappreciated. So people just assume that if they think they've learned something, then they will be fine on the day. But often our beliefs about what's good or bad for our learning are incorrect. And so just knowing that can then help prompt us to take a bit more care, if you like, self-care in ensuring that we know a particular topic before going into an exam or going into a job interview or so on. And one really efficient way of doing this, and this is not from the world of metacognition, just comes from the world of memory research, one really efficient way is to test yourself. So rather than just relying that you think you know the right answer, if you objectively test yourself on a particular topic, then you'll soon find out whether you really do know that material. And people's beliefs about whether testing themselves is good for them are woefully incorrect, right? So people don't think testing themselves is going to help them at all, but it turns out to be a really useful way of finding out whether you know a topic. So one other aspect that we think is going to be important in the future, why it's useful to study metacognition, is that we think it might be important for interacting with AI and other technology. So far I've talked about how metacognition is applied to yourself, so how we know that we know something. But we can also talk about metacognitive knowledge about other people's knowledge, or even what different pieces of technology know. So when you start a job in a new place, for instance, it's quite daunting because you don't know the right people to ask to get your ID cards, how to work the coffee machine, and so on. But once you've been around for a while, you have this information. And this is what psychologists call transactive memory. So it's the memory that we have about other people's memories. And I think that this topic of transactive memory is going to be important for understanding how we interact with technology, because now we don't only need to know what I know and know what other people know, but we also need to know what a particular piece of AI, such as Google, knows. And if we're confident that it knows, then we don't have to store the actual answer. We just need to store some metadata about where to find that answer. So this is very early days for this area of study, but we think that the way that we store that kind of metadata is a type of metacognition, and it might rely on very similar processes involved in metacognition about your own memory. And if that's the case, I think it's going to be an important area of study for understanding how we can interact better with technology.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that idea. I don't see the difference there between, I know that when I need to dig that I go out and grab the shovel. Like a shovel is for digging. Google is for knowing, how to look up recipes. I don't see that as being quite the same as metacognition.
Right. I mean, I think it has the same computational structure, if you like. So if I take the library cartel example, you have the ability to kind of index your own memory and know whether you know something. And what we don't know yet, and it could turn out to be, this is just a hypothesis and it's something we're actively working on, but it could turn out that the ability to index a memory store is actually quite general. And the ability to index what another device knows, it may rely on similar mechanisms involved in metacognition. It's not just saying, do we know what a device is for? It's really saying, how do we index the knowledge that another device has?
I'm seeing that as being a fairly fuzzy line between what something knows and what something can do.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what's interesting about this area of psychology is that it kind of got going in the late 80s. A psychologist at Harvard called Dan Wegner, who was really interested in this topic of what do we know about what other people know. But really, it dropped off after he stopped researching that area. So I think there's not a lot known about how we store those transactive memories. But I think it is something that we as society need to study if we're going going to be interacting with these machines that know a lot. And so how do we answer that question of how we know what something else knows? I think is philosophically quite a deep question, but hopefully we can get some traction on it by studying how people solve these problems in the lab.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Stephen Fleming for taking the time for that conversation. Several really interesting takeaways in there. You probably really can't underscore that enough, that metacognition might be an improvable skill, and that because it is likely one of these things that really does generalize across all sorts of different thinking that we do or analyzing of our own thought processes, it may actually get a get-out-of-jail-free card and actually be one of the few areas where skill transfer across a wide variety of domains is actually a reality. Somebody will have to do the studies to shore that up, but intuitively that does make a lot of sense. This is just one of those areas within neuroscience where you're really rooting for a lot of studies to get done fast, but more work to be done, a lot of psychological rocks still to look under. I'm going to throw a shout out back to episode number 123 of this show, where I interviewed Dr. Michael Graziano. This conversation about metacognition really reminded me of that episode in his book. If you go back and listen or re-listen to that episode, I think you'll hear not necessarily overlaps, but definitely ideas that might be complementary between what we just talked about and some of Dr. Graziano's theories of consciousness. Worth taking a trip down memory lane there, smartdrugsmarts.com/123. But as for this present episode, we will move along to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So they say that you've got to crawl before you can walk and you've got to walk before you can run. You might think that the mental corollary of that is that wrong comes before right. Metacognitively speaking, that seems not to be true. At least the concept of wrongness, of having a wrong idea, is a pretty advanced thing. Joe believes X, Joe will take actions based on his belief in X, but X is not actually correct. This concept that other entities can have ideas that are wrong is one of the bases of theory of mind, and only humans until recently were thought to be able to make it over this hurdle. But not so, according to Christopher Krupenia, an evolutionary anthropologist at Duke University, and Fumihiro Kano of Kyoto University in Japan. They did tests on 3 species of great apes, chimps, bonobos, and orangutans, getting them to watch a little soap opera-style great ape YouTube video that had a villain character steal a rock, hide a rock. The victim who had the rock stolen saw where the rock was hidden and then left, but then the villain changed the rock's hiding place, so the audience knew where the rock really was. The victim didn't. At that point, the villain exits stage left and the victim comes back into the room. The question is, where would the great apes look? They had eye-tracking software set up so they could see where the great apes were going to be looking. A healthy majority of the great apes looked at the place where the rock was originally hidden, not the place where they knew it actually wound up, because that was their expectation based on what they knew the victim knew as to where the victim would look for their lost rock. Says Victoria Southgate, the developmental psychologist who helped to create this eye-tracking technique originally used on 2-year-old human infants. She wasn't involved in this new ape research, but she said, "It's a very surprising and novel finding. It's almost an exact replication of the study that we did, and the apes appear to pass. It suggests that the capacity to track others' perspectives and beliefs is not unique to humans." Not everyone is convinced by the new study. Laurie Santos of Yale University did a study on rhesus macaques, where they failed to show an understanding of false beliefs in others. She says that the new paper raises more questions than it provides answers, because there have been so many past results showing that chimpanzees and other primates lack this capacity. But if you believe this new study, that's at least 3 new animals making it into the Theory of Mind Club. And if scientists are able to adjust the eye-tracking mechanisms that they've now used for baby humans and for apes, hopefully they can soon be doing tests on other types of animals.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that's it for episode number 197. Thank you for hanging around all the way until the end. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find the links to everything that we talked about here up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/197. And if you missed last week's episode, number 196, I spoke with Dr. Charles Nichols about the anti-inflammation effects of psychedelic compounds. That was based on mostly animal studies, some human anecdotal evidence, and of course it varies from one compound to the next, but there seems to be a trend there. And next week in 198, we're going to be getting into the weeds with something called moringa, which probably wouldn't be considered a weed. It's actually more like a tree, but all of this and more next week. Reminder, if you haven't done so yet, the Brain Breakfast newsletter is at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. Get yourself signed up there for sneak previews of episodes, post-game wrap-ups. As for the podcast, I will see you back here next week, coming at you as usual with an undiminished enthusiasm for helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not. And the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.